Welcome to Once Upon Yesterday, the podcast where we dust off the history books. I'm your host, James, and today we are diving into one of history's most dramatic turning points, the rise of Rome's first emperor, Augustus, and the moment the Roman Republic finally collapsed into an empire. Now, here's the thing about Rome in the 1st century BCE. It looked like the world's most successful democracy on the outside, but under the hood? Let's just say the engine was sputtering, leaking oil, and the wheels were about to fall off. Senators weren't calmly debating laws anymore. They were blocking votes out of spite, declaring religious holidays just to cancel meetings, and even resorting to violence. Imagine C-SPAN, but with more daggers and folding chairs. And into this chaos walked a teenager, Gaius Octavius. He wasn't a great general. He wasn't even particularly healthy, sickly most of his life. And yet, within a few decades, he would become Augustus Caesar, master of the Roman world. It's a story of political collapse, civil wars, betrayals, and one man's ability to outthink, outlast, and outmaneuver rivals who all seemed bigger, richer, and stronger than he was. Think of it like Survivor Ancient Rome. Instead of tribal councils, you had Senate sessions. Instead of immunity idols, you had legions of soldiers. And the prize? Not just $1 million, but control of the entire Mediterranean world. Today, we are going to explore how Augustus pulled it off, how the Roman Republic cracked, how Octavian became Caesar's heir, how he defeated Antony and Cleopatra, and how he transformed Rome into an empire that would last for centuries. And, just as importantly, how the Roman war machine made it all possible. So grab your toga, maybe pour yourself a goblet of wine, or hey, even just some coffee, and let's step back into a world on the edge of collapse, where one young man found a way to put the pieces back together and reshape history. Picture Rome in the year 133 BCE. For nearly 4 centuries, the Republic had been humming along like a well-oiled machine. There were laws, traditions, and above all, political norms that kept everyone in check. No one man was supposed to have too much power. If things got messy, Rome found a way to patch up its system, add a law here, tweak an office there, and keep the train rolling. But that year, something snapped. Enter Tiberius Gracchus. He was a tribune of the plebs, a kind of people's representative. And he had a bold idea: redistribute land to the poor. Sounds pretty reasonable, right? Well, the Senate didn't think so. To them, he was messing with their wealth and power. Tensions boiled over, and during an assembly meeting, the Senate did something unprecedented. They didn't just argue with him, they beat him to death with wooden chairs. That's right. The first political murder in the history of the Republic involved senators using furniture as weapons. In the Senate, it was like a WWE smackdown. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. Political violence became part of Rome's new normal. In the decades that followed, generals started building personal armies. See, traditionally, soldiers fought for the Republic, for the Senate and the people of Rome. The SPQR you see carved on Roman monuments. But now, they were fighting for whoever promised them land, loot, and retirement benefits. Marius, for example, recruited the poor into his armies by promising them farms after service. His rival, Sulla, went even further. He actually marched his army on Rome itself, twice. Imagine a U.S. general bringing his troops into Washington, D.C. to settle a political debate. That's the level of chaos Rome had reached. And things kept spiraling. Pompey rose to fame, crushing pirates and conquering in the East. Crassus used his incredible wealth to buy influence. And Julius Caesar, the rising star, built his reputation in Gaul with a loyal, battle-hardened army. Together, these three formed the first triumvirate, a not-so-secret power alliance. You could think of it as a political big three, like LeBron, Wade, and Bosch forming a super team. But in this case, the basketball was the Roman Republic. But alliances didn't last. Ambition kept pulling them apart. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BCE, literally marching his army into Italy, in defiance of the Senate, it was the point of no return. Civil war erupted. Caesar versus Pompey. And Rome, once the proud republic that prided itself on law and order, was now tearing itself apart. By the time Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, stabbed by senators who claimed to be saving liberty, Rome was exhausted. The Republic was hanging on by a thread, plagued by political murders, private armies, land grabs, and endless power struggles. The cracks in the system weren't cracks anymore. They were gaping chasms, and in those gaps, someone was bound to step in. And that's where a sickly teenager named Octavian enters the stage. So, Rome is in shambles. Julius Caesar has just been assassinated in 44, stabbed to death by a group of senators who thought they were saving the Republic. You know the story. Et tu, Brute? And all that. But here's the twist that most people forget. When Caesar died, he left behind an heir. Not a son he raised, but an 18-year-old great-nephew named Gaius Octavius. We'll just call him Octavian for now. Now, Octavian wasn't exactly cut out to be Rome's next strongman, at least on paper. He was small, often sick, not known for dazzling speeches or heroic military campaigns. Honestly, if you were placing bets, you wouldn't have put a single denarius on this kid becoming master of the Roman world. But Octavian had two big advantages. First, Caesar adopted him in his will. That meant he got Caesar's name, his fortune, and most importantly, the loyalty of Caesar's soldiers. Second, he had something you can't buy in Rome: patience and cunning. Here's the scene. Octavian sails back to Italy from Greece after hearing of Caesar's assassination. Everyone, his family, advisors, even his stepdad, tells him, "Stay out of this. It's dangerous. You're 18. Go study and live your life." And Octavian basically says, "Nope." At first, nobody takes him seriously. Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man, figures that he's the natural successor. Cicero, the great orator, thinks he can use Octavian as a pawn against Antony. But here's where Octavian shows his genius. He plays everyone. He starts by honoring Caesar's memory, holding public games, paying Caesar's promised gifts to the Roman people out of his own pocket. Where did he get the money? He didn't have it. He borrowed and begged. But the symbolism mattered. To ordinary Romans, Octavian looked like a true son of Caesar, stepping up where others hesitated. And then there's the soldiers. These were battle-hardened veterans who'd fought under Caesar. Octavian approached them, not with bravado, but with loyalty. He said, "I'm Caesar's heir. I'm here to finish what he started." And guess what? They rallied to him. Soldiers didn't care if you're sickly. They care if you can pay them and lead them to glory. Soon enough, Octavian was at the head of armies, and the Senate, desperate to counter Antony, actually made him consul. Imagine that, an 18-year-old kid suddenly one of the two highest officials in Rome. If Rome had an Instagram back then, he'd have gone viral overnight. Teenager becomes consul, commands legions. And Octavian wasn't done. Realizing Antony was too strong to defeat alone, he struck a deal with Antony and another power player, Lepidus. Together, the three formed the Second Triumvirate. It was like a power-sharing dictatorship legalized by the Senate. But in reality, It was a license for them to rule Rome with near absolute authority. One of their first acts? Proscriptions. They literally posted lists of enemies whose property would be seized and whose heads would be collected. About 300 senators and 2,000 knights were killed, including Cicero, who had once thought he could manipulate Octavian. This was Octavian's ruthless side coming out. He wasn't just the sickly teenager anymore. He was showing that he could be cold and calculating when it mattered. With their enemies purged at home, the triumvirs turned their attention abroad. In 42 BCE, Octavian and Antony faced Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, at the Battle of Philippi. Antony took the lead in the battle, while Octavian, still green and reportedly ill, played a supporting role. But victory was victory. Brutus and Cassius killed themselves, and the so-called liberators of the Republic were gone. By his early 20s, Octavian had done the unthinkable. He had gone from a nobody to one of Rome's most powerful men. He had avenged Caesar, secured armies, and carved out his place in Rome's brutal political world. Not bad for a teenager everyone underestimated. But, of course, when you put ambitious men in the same room, peace never lasts. And Octavian's next challenge was his most daring yet: Mark Antony, Cleopatra, and the ultimate showdown for Rome. So, by the early 30s BCE, the second triumvirate was crumbling. Lepidus had been sidelined, basically pushed into retirement with a "thanks for your service" fruit basket. That left just two men in charge of Rome's vast world, Mark Antony and Octavian. Antony had the East, rich provinces like Greece, Egypt, and Asia Minor. Octavian had the West, Italy, Spain, and Gaul. On paper, this arrangement could have worked. But come on, this is Rome. Power sharing never lasts. And Antony, well, Antony made the mistake of a lifetime. He fell in love with Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. Now, let's pause here. Cleopatra gets a bad rap in Roman sources because, well, Romans were the ones writing the story, and they loved blaming women, especially foreign women, for men's political decisions. But the truth is, Cleopatra was brilliant, charismatic, multilingual, politically savvy, and a ruler in her own right. Antony wasn't just smitten. He was also tapping into Egypt's enormous wealth. Together, they looked like a power couple who could rival Rome itself. But to Romans back home, this was scandalous. Imagine your top general leaving his Roman wife, who, by the way, was Octavian's sister, Octavia, for a foreign queen. This wasn't just gossip. It was political dynamite. Octavian seized the opportunity. He launched one of the most ruthless PR campaigns in history. He painted Antony as weak, indulgent, practically hypnotized by Cleopatra. Roman propaganda showed Antony living like an Eastern king, drinking, feasting, and bowing to Cleopatra as if he were a servant. Think of it like ancient political ads: grainy, black and white footage, ominous music, and a voiceover saying, "Do you want this man, a puppet of Egypt, ruling Rome?" And the Romans bought it. Tensions boiled over in 32 BCE. Antony divorced Octavia, Octavian's sister, and openly declared his loyalty to Cleopatra. Octavian struck back, seizing Antony's will from the Vestal Virgins and reading it out loud in the Senate. In it, Antony promised land to Cleopatra's children and asked to be buried in Alexandria, not Rome. To Romans, that was treason. By now, war was inevitable. Octavian declared war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. It was a clever move. He framed it as a foreign war, not a civil war, making it easier for Romans to rally behind him. Then came the showdown, the Battle of Actium, 31 BCE. Picture this: Antony and Cleopatra's massive fleet, hundreds of ships strong, anchored off the coast of western Greece. On the other side, Octavian's fleet, commanded by his boyhood friend and naval genius, Marcus Agrippa. The battle raged for hours. Ships clashed, oars snapped, arrows flew. And then suddenly, Cleopatra's ship turned and fled. Antony, seeing her go, abandoned the fight and followed her. Just like that, their fleet collapsed. Only a fraction of Antony's ships were able to escape. The optics were disastrous. To Romans, Antony looked like he ditched his men for his lover. Octavian had the perfect victory narrative: disciplined Rome versus decadent Egypt. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt, but it was over. As Octavian closed in, they both chose suicide rather than surrender. Antony falling on his sword, Cleopatra famously with an asp, though the exact method is debated. With their deaths, the last resistance was gone. Octavian marched into Egypt, annexed it as his personal province, and seized its treasure. That money allowed him to pay off his soldiers and secure absolute control. Rome now had a single ruler. The Republic was not just weakened, it was dead. And that ruler was no longer just Octavian. He would soon take on a new title, one that would echo through history: Augustus. So it's 31 BCE. Antony and Cleopatra are gone. Egypt is in Roman hands, and Octavian stands as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world. At just 32 years old, he has done the impossible. He's outlasted every rival, outmaneuvered every general, and transformed himself from a sickly teenager into Rome's sole ruler. But here's the problem. Rome hated kings. The very idea of one holding all the power was poison to Roman political culture. Remember, they had stabbed Julius Caesar to death just years earlier for acting too much like a monarch. So Octavian had to play this very carefully. And here's where his genius really shines. In 27 BCE, Octavian staged a brilliant piece of political theater. Standing before the Senate, he declared that he was restoring the Republic. He offered to hand back all extraordinary powers and let the Senate and people of Rome run things again. It was a masterstroke of optics. The Senate, of course, begged him not to. Oh no, please, Octavian, don't leave us to govern ourselves. Stay for the good of the state. And Octavian, with what must have been a very humble smirk, said, fine. He'd take back responsibility just for the most dangerous provinces, the ones with the majority of Rome's legions: Spain, Gaul, Syria, and Egypt. In other words, he kept control of the army, the money, and the grain supply. The Senate rewarded him with a new title, Augustus. The word means the revered one, with religious overtones. He wasn't a king or a dictator. Those words were too toxic. Instead, he was princeps, the first citizen. Just an ordinary Roman citizen who happened to control all the armies and all the wealth of the empire. It was a political sleight of hand. On paper, the Republic still existed. The Senate still met, consuls were still elected, but in reality, nothing important happened without Augustus's approval. Elections continued, but candidates only ran if Augustus gave a nod. Think of it like high school elections where the principal handpicks the candidates. Sure, there's a vote, but the outcome is already decided. And here's the thing. Romans were okay with it. After nearly a century of civil wars, assassinations, and chaos, Augustus offered peace and stability. He promised no more land theft, no more prescriptions, no more generals marching armies into Rome. just order. People were exhausted, and Augustus gave them what they wanted most: predictability. Even the Senate, once the proud guardian of liberty, became more like a ceremonial club. They still wore their togas, still debated, still passed decrees, but everyone knew who was really in charge. Augustus didn't abolish the Republic. He hollowed it out and wore it like a mask. And the brilliance of this arrangement? It stuck. For the next 200 years, emperors would rule under the guise of restoring the Republic. It was the ultimate political cover. One man with all the power, hiding behind the forms of tradition. So, in just a few years, Octavian had transformed himself into Augustus. Not a tyrant, not a king, but the first citizen of Rome. The man who made one-man rule acceptable to a people who once swore they'd never tolerate it. And with supreme power secured, Augustus turned to the real work, reshaping Rome, reforming the army, and laying the foundations for centuries of peace, the Pax Romana. With his position secure, Augustus now faced the real challenge. How do you take a republic that's been torn apart by a century of civil wars and turn it into something stable, something lasting? Augustus's answer was both simple and revolutionary. You keep the army strong, the streets calm, the food flowing, and the people entertained. First, the army. When Augustus came to power, Rome had about 60 legions. That's a lot of soldiers, hundreds of thousands of men who, if unpaid or restless, could turn on the state. Augustus knew this was unsustainable, so he cut the number almost in half, down to 28 legions. Each one permanent, professional, and loyal not to random generals, but to him, personally. To make that loyalty stick, he set up a retirement plan. Soldiers who served 20 years weren't just cut loose. They got land or a cash payout from a special military treasury. Think of it as an ancient Roman 401k, but instead of mutual funds, you got a farm in Gaul. This reform gave soldiers a stake in the empire's stability. And then there were the Praetorian Guard. Augustus created this elite unit of hand-picked soldiers stationed right in Italy. Officially, they were there to protect the emperor. Unofficially, they were his personal insurance policy against rebellion. Later emperors would learn just how powerful the Praetorians could become, but under Augustus, they made sure no one got any bright ideas about overthrowing him. But Augustus didn't just rule through soldiers. He understood the value of appearances. He poured money into rebuilding Rome itself: roads, aqueducts, temples, forums. He famously boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Infrastructure wasn't just practical, it was propaganda. Every shiny new building whispered, "See? Augustus brought you this." He even started something like a postal service, with relay stations along Roman roads so messages could travel across the empire faster than ever before. Communication was power, and Augustus made sure he could reach from Spain to Syria without delay. Then came the cultural side. Augustus knew that power isn't just swords and coins, it's stories. He sponsored writers like Virgil, Horace, and Livy. Virgil's Aeneid wasn't just a poem about a Trojan hero. It was basically a national epic glorifying Rome's destiny, and by extension, Augustus himself. Literature became political PR, and Augustus was the star of the show. And let's not forget the bread and circuses. Augustus understood that hungry, bored people are dangerous. So he made sure the grain supply flowed into Rome's markets and supported grand public games. Gladiators, chariot races, theatrical performances, these weren't just entertainment. They were a pressure valve, keeping the restless city population happy and distracted. The result of all this was something Rome hadn't experienced in living memory: stability. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For roughly 2 centuries, the empire would enjoy relative calm, free from the kind of civil wars that had torn the republic apart. Trade flourished, cities grew, cultures blended under Roman rule. Now, let's be clear. Peace, in this sense, didn't mean Augustus was a pacifist. Rome's legions were still marching, still fighting wars on the frontiers, but the violence was directed outward, not inward. And if you were a Roman citizen in Italy, Gaul, or Spain, life felt remarkably steady. You could farm, trade, raise your family, and trust that the empire would be there tomorrow. Augustus's genius was not in winning flashy battles. That was Antony's territory, or Agrippa's. His genius was in building a system where power was centralized, but disguised, where armies were loyal, but professional, and where people were so grateful for peace that they didn't mind their freedom quietly slipping away. The Republic was gone, but Rome had entered a new era, one of marble cities, professional armies, and an emperor who called himself the first citizen. And at the heart of it all, making the Pax Romana possible, was the Roman war machine. So far, we've talked about Augustus the politician, Augustus the strategist, Augustus the empire builder. But what about Augustus the man? Who was he when he wasn't orchestrating propaganda or reforming the army? Truth is, he was complicated. Early in his career, Augustus would be shockingly ruthless. Remember those proscriptions under the Second Triumvirate? He signed off on lists of enemies whose property was confiscated and whose heads were literally hunted. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, was one of them. And that wasn't a mistake or an accident. It was cold political calculus. If you stood in Augustus's way in those early years, you didn't last long. But as he grew older, he reinvented himself. By the time he was firmly in power, Augustus projected the image of a wise, fatherly leader. He lived modestly compared to the gaudy aristocrats around him. His house on the Palatine Hill wasn't a palace dripping with gold. It was relatively simple, decorated with frescoes of gardens rather than jewels. He wore plain clothes, ate modest meals, and liked to present himself as a man of old Roman values, not luxury and excess. Of course, his propaganda machine helped sell that image. Coins showed him as youthful and godlike. Statues gave him an aura of calm authority. Writers like Livy and Virgil painted him as the man chosen by fate to bring order to the world. It's a bit like modern politicians staging photo ops at dinners, eating pie with the locals, except in Augustus's case, the locals had to worship him as a living god after his death. But Augustus's personal life? That was really messy. He married 3 times, divorcing one wife on the very day she gave birth. His third wife, Livia Drusilla, became his partner for life and a sharp political mind in her own right. Together, they built a dynasty. But it wasn't smooth sailing. Augustus exiled his only biological child, Julia, for what he called immorality. Translation: she wasn't living up to his strict family values, and the rumors of her affairs were too much for his image. He also exiled her daughter, his granddaughter, for the same reason. For a man who preached morality, Augustus had no hesitation in sacrificing family members to maintain his reputation. Physically, Augustus wasn't particularly imposing. Ancient sources describe him as short, often sick, with bad teeth. His health was so fragile that people were constantly surprised he lived as long as he did. But he had presence. His eyes, according to the historian Suetonius, were so bright and piercing that people said it was like staring into the sun. When he looked at you, you felt it. Combine that with his calm demeanor, and suddenly his sickly frame didn't matter. He radiated authority. And here's an irony. Augustus wasn't even a great general. He wasn't Caesar, leading legions into Gaul or crossing the Rubicon. He left most of the actual fighting to his brilliant right-hand man, Agrippa, and later to capable generals like Tiberius, his eventual successor. Augustus's genius wasn't swinging a sword, it was building the systems that made the swords effective. When he died in 14 CE, the Senate declared him a god. Statues went up, temples were built, and Augustus became Divus Augustus, the divine Augustus. From a sickly teenager everyone underestimated, he had become a god in the Roman pantheon. Talk about a glow-up. But maybe the most important thing about Augustus is this. He set the pattern. Every emperor who followed him, good, bad, or downright unhinged, was living in the system Augustus built. He wasn't just Rome's first emperor. He was a template. From ruthless opportunist to godlike figure, Augustus was a man of contradictions. Ruthless yet calculating. Modest yet ambitious. Fragile yet enduring. And the empire he built, for better or worse, would last for centuries. So, what do we make of Augustus? On one hand, he was ruthless. He exiled his daughter, executed rivals, and used propaganda like a scalpel. On the other hand, he rebuilt a broken state, gave Rome stability after a century of chaos, and set the stage for one of the most remarkable stretches of peace in world history, the Pax Romana. And that's the paradox of Augustus. He wasn't just a man, he was a system designed to last, to keep Rome running smoothly, to make the empire feel inevitable. He took the Republic's shattered pieces and glued them back together, not in their original form, but into something new, something stronger, something lasting. But let's be real. Augustus didn't do it all by himself. Behind the marble statues, the poets, the propaganda, there was something more tangible, more powerful, and frankly, more terrifying: the Roman legions. Augustus could talk about peace, but peace only existed because the legions enforced it. Roads were safe because legions patrolled them. Rebellions fizzled because legions crushed them. Provinces paid their taxes because legions stood ready to collect. Even Augustus's own power rested on their loyalty. He might have called himself the first citizen, but without the Roman war machine, he was just another politician with good branding. And the legions weren't just soldiers. They were builders, engineers, and settlers. They dug ditches, built bridges, and carved roads across continents. They spread Roman culture, language, and law to the farthest edges of Europe and beyond. Every city that grew up around a Roman fort, every trade route that hummed with activity, every frontier that held against invaders, it all traced back to the war machine. And here's the thing. Augustus knew this. He didn't expand recklessly like Caesar. He consolidated, organized, and professionalized. He made the legions permanent, disciplined, and loyal to the empire instead of to individual generals. It's why his empire lasted long after his death. So when we look at Augustus, we're really looking at a man who harnessed the most effective military system the ancient world had ever seen, and used it not just for conquest, but for stability. He built an empire on their shoulders, and for 2 centuries, the world would live under their shadow. And that, my friends, is where we're headed next. In our next episode, we'll strip away the politics and focus on the heart of it all, the Roman war machine. We'll look at how the legions trained, fought, and lived. how they could build a fortress in a day, march across mountains, and still have the energy to crush enemies in battle. We'll see how discipline and engineering, not just brute force, turned Rome into the empire we still talk about today. So join me next time for the Roman War Machine. Until then, I'm James, and this has been Once Upon Yesterday, where we dust off the history books and uncover the stories that still shape our world today. If you liked this episode, please follow this podcast so you can stay up to date on new episodes as they come out. I'll see you next time.